Welcome back to Creative Culture. My name is Steve Ramsey, and this is a podcast about how art and creativity intersects with our lives on a daily basis. My goal is for listeners to pause to consider all the amazing things that people create and how they help us define who we are as a culture. Also, I just got back from a podcasting conference. Stewart, I got to talk to you about this hotel I stayed in, by the way, but we'll get into
I'd love to hear about it.
But if there was one big takeaway I learned from this conference, it's that the future of podcasting seems to be on YouTube. Wow, everybody is rushing to YouTube. So starting with this episode, I'll be posting full video episodes on the Creative Culture YouTube channel. That's a channel I've had that's just pretty much been languishing there for a couple of years now. So you can find that on YouTube at Creative Culture Pod. It's probably going to be a little rough for now because video editing is time consuming and kind of cuts into my day job. Well, you know what we should do is we should do a lot of really visual stuff. So people have
flying animations happening.
Right. So people have to see the video. But of course the audio version will continue to be available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or as they say, wherever you listen to podcasts. Do you listen to any podcasts, Stewart?
Oh yeah, I do. Both on just audio and on YouTube. So I understand the appeal for some of them.
YouTube, it's crazy.
And then I also understand certain podcasts' resistance to it because maybe it makes a guest feel self-conscious in a way that they wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah.
I can see either side.
Stewart Hicks is an associate professor in the School of Architecture at the University of Illinois at Chicago, an associate dean in the College of Architecture, Design, and the Arts, and is the co-founder of the practice Design with Company. On top of all that, he's got a kick-ass YouTube channel exploring mostly urban architectural topics and making highly polished, well-researched, fun, educational videos. You'll learn about skyscraper features you're not meant to notice, how the humble 2x4 revolutionized home building in America, the Chicago window, which you've probably seen everywhere but you never gave much thought to, and how courtrooms are biased in the way they're laid out. You don't have to know the least bit about architecture to become hooked on Stewart's videos. Hey, Stewart, it's great to see you again.
Good to see you. I hope that recording of that will stay around. I love that introduction and summary. That was great. Thank you for doing that. And thanks for having me on. This is exciting.
You know, it seems odd to me that on a show about art and creativity, it just took me so long to have an architect on. But I'm really intrigued by a statement you have on your website because I think it's what I'm trying to explore with this podcast. Okay, so on your Design with Company website, it says, Design with Company explores the territory between the architectural and the literary, real and unreal, mundane and fantastic. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So you're quoting a side of me that I don't publicize in the YouTube space all that much. You know, the academic side and the
you never mention it.
I know. Yeah. So yeah, I prior to starting YouTube, I focused on designing architecture in a way that was, you know, pretty esoteric in a certain way. I'm a professor, and you know, doing research means building and designing things that are, you know, not necessarily the most publicly accessible, but like really interrogating close concepts in architecture. And one of the things that interested me is the relationship between fiction and stories and real space. And I got really excited about a term that maybe we use today, like, and that term is character. So like people talking about a space having character or something like that. And in architecture, that was a really important term in the 1800s, whether a building had character or not, and it hadn't been used in 100 years in a serious architectural discourse space. And so I was trying to figure out how we could reincorporate it, because it seems like a really great way of talking about space is having character, and it's a word that we would use to describe ourselves. And we have character, and what does that mean? And so that was where my research was at. And so I've been diving into this relationship between stories and space in really focused, deep ways, as well as I think that it translated into the YouTube space. I before starting, I listened to a 99% Invisible podcast by Roman Mars, where he talked about the power of one of the riverboat tours that he had taken in Chicago. And when he learned about the story of why the building was the way it was, he all of a sudden was able to have a new appreciation for it, even if he didn't like it. And so I think that this relationship that our surroundings have stories to them, that if you were to tap into them, could appreciate them in a new way, just feels really exciting to me, and has driven the videos that I try to make on YouTube.
Kind of what you're saying is that architecture exists or is sort of defined by an art form. In other words, I mean, I can design a tool shed in SketchUp or Fusion 360 or something, but it's hardly architecture because it's just a building. How is this any way that you would define architecture?
Yeah, I mean, that debate of what is architecture, what isn't. Architecture is both an art and a science. What does that mean? I think has been around for a long time. And I guess I would personally side on, well, if you showed people how you were making that shed and sort of gathered an audience around trying to understand that shed in a unique way, I would call that architecture, because to me that's what exactly. So I would call that architecture, because to me architecture is that. It's like people collecting around the built environment, objects in the built environment, and sort of building an audience around it, and that sort of thing. So for me, a shed very much could be architecture if it just kind of gets built and it serves its function. I guess then the question of whether it matters if it's architecture or not doesn't really factor into it. And it's not that I wouldn't call it architecture. It's just, I don't know if it makes sense to debate it too much.
Right. It seems like a liberal definition of architecture. And it seems like as an architect, I think that's probably, is that refreshing to hear? Or do you think is there a lot of gatekeeping in architecture?
Oh, geez.
Like anything else right now.
Oh, yeah. But there's a spectrum. I think there's people who think that architecture is a kind of closed system, exclusive closed system, that unless you know the full history of architecture, you shouldn't even bother making a building. Or, there's definitely those folks that exist. But, I think that that's waning a little bit. And, you talk about the art side. I think about it as an art, but an artful way of understanding the world, even though, that includes the technical, so I think that's part of the story of why and how things exist. And so I think that the art part is also a way of understanding the technical without necessarily putting one over the other or anything like that, for sure.
Do you think urban environments have the edge here? Because I love this concept of telling the architecture has roots in telling stories and comes from this storytelling aspect. Where I was out in Denver a few weeks ago for this podcasting conference, and when you go out to the suburbs, and this is true in any metropolitan area, there is just a unique blandness about every single one. It's like strip mall after strip mall. And I think they all look alike. I have no idea where I am. If it weren't for Google Maps, it's just all blends together. And yet architects have to design this stuff.
Yeah. In various periods of our history, there was in the 70s, these architects that wrote a book learning from AMP parking lots. Which was an attempt for architects to take seriously, drugstore parking lot, and that a lot of our world is those spaces, and architects should appreciate and participate and learn to like them in some way enough so that that they could operate in that space. I think, there's a ubiquity to some of those spaces, but your question was about like whether the city is more ripe for that. And I think the city is easy to point at a thing, like if you think of the city as an object that a lot of people have an understanding of. So like you point at Chicago and millions of people know what that is, versus a strip mall. That particular strip mall, no one will know about. The idea of a strip mall, yes, but it feels a little more nebulous. You've got to abstract it a little bit. And so I think the idea that the city allows you to point very specifically at a thing and talk about it, and people will know it, I think helps. I think Chicago, too, is a unique one that has done a lot of work to try to maintain its architecture city like status, and so a lot of the stories about the city of Chicago kind of already live out there in some form, and it makes it a little bit, it's nice as a kind of place for me to be able to tap into to tell some of those stories for sure.
Yeah, I think Chicago is one of those few cities that has, well, you've had a video on skylines before, but it has a real defining skyline. It's a skyline that people can look at. It's not like, it's very similar, I mean, not similar, but the way people look at New York, and you can identify New York skyline. You don't have to ever have been there. Where I live, San Francisco, I think also has a very defining skyline. But I think that's in American cities is sort of rare unless you live in that city. I mean, again, to use the example of Denver, I think Denver would be defined by the backdrop, the mountains. And like other places, to me, as an outsider, like St. Louis I don't think I would recognize it without the arch. If you look at any kind of like graphic image, it's always going to have the St. Louis arch, or even to a certain extent, maybe like Seattle with the Space Needle. I'm not sure if I would, but I might be too far removed from it too.
Part of it, what it goes into that I think is a little bit the fact that most of the cities you said that had a definite skyline are ones that you can step back from and have a specific view of. So there's a water edge, right, and you can get away. You can see this kind of, this one view. Seattle has that too, so it's not exactly consistent across the board, but like St. Louis, it's a little bit harder to get outside of St. Louis and have a snapshot of it that is iconic. You might be coming at it from lots of different directions, versus Chicago. You come at it from pretty specific spots, and those are the images that get shared, and it kind of lives in your head that way for sure.
Yeah, you can always define the city like that from its geography and its relationship to water, and then the land maybe on the other side. I think of, again, San Francisco as a peninsula. You can approach it anywhere, and you can see, okay, there's the two bridges, Golden Gate and then the Bay Bridge, and then the city itself is defined by not just a single recognizable building. For a while, maybe people would think of Coit Tower or Transamerica Pyramid, and now it's Salesforce Tower. But they all seem to fit, of course, all the hills too. So you've got kind of a backdrop of this that sort of defines those skylines. But I don't know, I think skylines are an interesting concept because they define cities, and yet they're not something that's specifically planned that way.
Yeah, that fascinates me too. It's a kind of collective project. It's there's no one single person or endeavor that can shape it wholly. And I mean, that's kind of when I made a video about it, what I was trying to do. I think the title has something to do with the design of skylines. And there were some comments about, well, they're not exactly designed. And I think, I agree with that. But I do maybe think that there's ways of thinking about it that are interesting. Like if you think of it like a garden, like you're tending a garden, and there are ways of appreciating the aesthetic of gardens that I think you could transfer. So there are movements like the picturesque and ways of understanding the sort of variability that comes about in natural landscapes that I think could be applied to thinking about and appreciating skylines for their design and their beauty.
Yeah, we wouldn't look at a landscape and necessarily identify it by like symmetry and even a necessarily planned. I guess that would be more of a planned garden. Right. But for most landscapes that we look at, I would think it's those irregularities but it's just the way that they all kind of come together organically somehow.
There are times where I suspect the architect very consciously, looked at what this building will look like from a mile away, a half mile away, from this angle, from that angle, next to this building. I think that there are times where it looks pretty clear that happened, and other times maybe where it was more about setting itself apart. So you get really problematic conditions where every single tall building is trying to be iconic and step away from the others, and then the city just becomes a collection of statements, people yelling at each other, rather than something that ever coheres. Versus something that coheres as something that could even be considered a planned thing or designed.
Was the Sears Tower, I remember at one time that was the tallest building in the world, if I'm not mistaken. Was that controversial when that? I'm sure it was when that was built. Would the people of Chicago like that? Did they embrace that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think anytime something big like that happens, you have detractors and people who love it. I mean, I think, the era of that tower, there was just such a union between the design of the structure and the tower itself that I think people really got around. So like the Hancock Tower, you can see the structure, and I think that people like that. And the Sears Tower is that too. It's not the same, but it's this bundled tubes that work together, and it was just so innovative structurally in a way that gets expressed in the way the tower was designed that I think people tend to like, because there's a kind of transparency to the way to its design, and I don't know. It's big and dark and those sorts of things.
It sort of helps define Chicago. I mean,
yeah, for sure.
Is it still called the Sears Tower?
It's the Willis Tower.
Everybody calls it that. Yeah.
Yeah, there was an event like a couple years ago where the power went out in the entire tower, and the only lights that stayed on in the building were 2 at the top, and then a line underneath, and it looked like the Sears Tower was kind of not pleased.
Oh, that's great. It's like
and
tower emoji.
Yeah, exactly. It was a pretty great image for a night.
Oh wow. Yeah, I think about the iconic buildings like that, and they always have something special. You look at like a Chrysler building. I mean, isn't that just representative of Art Deco, architecture, or even architecture of, well, again, in San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge, Art Deco, and Transamerica building was very controversial in San Francisco when it was built, and now that's the defining feature of the skyline. So people come around.
I love that process. Like we started with this conversation about stories and people learning to embrace things, and I'm really fascinated with that process. That it's at first, it's people hate it, like the Eiffel Tower. Yeah. Everyone hated the Eiffel Tower when it was built, and then over time, its uniqueness grows on you, and it becomes a point of identity and relating to it. And I think that that process is really fascinating to me. And I guess, that's part of why I like to make the videos. Like, I think that a lot of architecture, or some of architecture, is hard to like. It's kind of off-putting for various reasons. Maybe the architect wanted it to be off-putting in a certain way, and that puts a barrier between people acceptance of architecture and things like that. And I'm just really fascinated with that process, that it can reverse. It can be the most hated thing can become the most loved thing.
Well, what's some of the controversial architecture happening currently?
Yeah, it's interesting because I have my foot in a couple different spaces. So in school, there's this trend of buildings looking very unfinished, looking very heavy, and I could see that being kind of off-putting to people. Like it looks like raw concrete again, and people didn't like brutalism for things like that. So that kind of
see, I kind of like brutalism. There's something about it that's just like so dramatic now. But
so I think that might be something that is really off-putting to people.
But everybody will come around. Oh, it's the Burj Khalifa. That's the building.
I guess I don't have a good temperature on people's reception of that building. I think people get caught up in the tallness of things. That one is pretty removed, and it's by itself, and it kind of like looks.
I think that's the thing, is that it's just like not really part of a skyline.
Yeah, and then a lot has to do with the way that it touches the ground. So I was in Detroit when they built a Renaissance Center, and it's a kind of fortress at its base. And, it doesn't really, it's not very accessible to the city. It doesn't really give back to the city. And I think that with locals is a real problem. If it with the way it touches the ground, it is problematic. It's not even how it looks like in the skyline. It's just kind of how it touches down that matters.
So I guess there's a big problem right now, at least around here, is that during the pandemic, so many offices shuttered down in financial district in San Francisco. They're not coming back. And so, it's like this is kind of a desert in parts of the city where there's just massive amounts of floors of office spaces are just empty. And, I hear people say, and I think you've addressed this in one of your videos, is that, well, yeah, convert it into apartments or housing, and you just can't do that, can you?
Not always. There's a lot of work being done to try to figure that out. So older buildings tend to be a little easier to convert because they have a smaller footprint. They usually have operable windows. That's a big hiccup here in Chicago. Newer, bigger office towers don't have operable windows, and it's required by code that all residential units have an operable window. So what do you do? Reskin the whole thing? That's not so easy. Right. There's other mixed use options, things like that. Hotels, maybe with, in New York, Airbnb is getting pushed out right now. And maybe that will put different pressures on the different tourism industries and things like that. That could be an option. But yeah, it's certainly a problem. Housing is one solution to that. We feel it very acutely here in Chicago. I would imagine too, maybe a little different for different reasons in San Francisco. Like I think, there's probably a lot of working from home still in a way that in Chicago, it'd be easier to work around, I think. It's a real problem for cities right now. And there's a great pilot program here that's happening that the whole financial street, LaSalle, is a lot of the buildings are getting converted, and a lot of them have to have a certain percentage of affordable housing too. Yeah. And how that gets integrated and what that means is a real question, and people are really actively figuring it out. Yeah,
these are really kind of cutting edge problems happening right now everywhere, it seems like. And the way I understand it is that a lot of these, the high-rise office buildings it's almost impossible to convert those to a residential building just because of the way that they're built. And you mentioned the windows, but just the infrastructure of those isn't suitable for, just think, you would have to chop up each floor and basically build a brand new floor, bathrooms, bedrooms. We had to reframe everything out. And so it's just not cost effective to do anything like this. I think that there's got to be some solutions to this. What would in your dream world, what would be your solution?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting that, skyscrapers only really been around for 100 years, and the problem even of recycling or tearing down a skyscraper hasn't been asked that often, so it's not that clear how to take down a skyscraper. Right. So we're at this kind of cycle of even, first generation skyscrapers get built. What do we do with these? We're kind of coming, and I think it feels like for people, they've been around forever, or they've gone through different cycles and we should know what to do. But no, we're kind of at this kind of, it's an evolving problem for sure. I did see one solution. So there's a solution. There was a fully renovated building in Australia where they took off the facade of the whole tower. Then they built a new core of a tower right next to the old one, connected the floors, and then reskinned both. And made a beautiful open space on the top. And that's one of the very first truly recycled towers, I think, that I can think of, not just sort of renovated, but really renovated really extensively. Other solutions I've seen, the problem for big office towers are the size of the floor plate is just too big. for housing reasons. And some that I've seen speculative are just like selective cuts into the towers, like channels that would go from the ground level all the way up. And if you cut this channel in a big tower, you can put in a new facade on those where you just cut into, and that can have operable windows and things. And it effectively reduces the size of the floor plate so that you can have access to windows in different places and closer access to the core where the plumbing is coming out and things like that. And that seems really promising to me if the shape of the building is sort of getting into the problem. So maybe a selective editing away of the building is actually what allows it to be used more efficiently and effectively.
It just seems to me, with so many people working from home and having other ways of working now, that we could be facing more and more of these downtown deserts. And maybe cities, downtown areas are going to eventually just start to shrink in size. I mean, literal physical size. We may be at the end of the era of the skyscraper.
Yeah, it's plausible. It's very plausible. And cities might drastically change. I think suburbs are changing too, so office parks and things like that, which are also big resource intensive places, just aren't coming back. So what do you do with those? That's also
they're all becoming Amazon warehouse.
Yeah. It's like, is that what we want?
It's
so
like the dead malls.
Yeah. So I think changing the nature of work, it's immediately felt in cities, especially because of the 5-year lease cycle and things like that. And that's part of why we're feeling it right now, that, like the leases are up and things like that. But it'll affect a lot of different places in very different ways, I think.
Wow. I just saw a video you did with Devin over at Legal Eagle. That was real fun, about courtrooms and how they're kind of designed. There's a lot of things I never really thought about, how the kind of the hierarchy and the different levels of where people sit.
Right.
And everything.
Yeah. And like, they seem like such terrible places. Well, ones I've been in seem like such terrible places, and just knowing why they're terrible, I think, is useful, so just being able to slog through sitting in a space for a long period of time that has to be that way for various reasons. I don't know if you saw the show Jury Duty.
I did, yeah.
Oh my God, it was so
hilarious.
good, right?
It was so good. Oh my God. Yeah.
I just loved it. I mean, in relationship to the design, got to see a little bit about the inner workings of courtrooms, and then what they had to do for the documentary aspect of it, and how they had to change things up was interesting to see. I only saw that after the video I made, so I was always comparing it to what I had learned recently, and I learned a lot from that show as well. It's so good. Oh
man, if you're listening to this and you haven't seen Jury Duty, do yourself a favor. You can binge watch it, pretty easily. And it's just so that the conceit is that it's a documentary about a jury, like following a jury along in a civil case, and but the conceit is that they're all actors except for the one guy who's not an actor, doesn't know that it's not a real documentary, and it's just brilliant.
And the acting is so fantastic.
It is, yeah.
That you can't tell. I mean, it was just so well done, that the craft of it, in addition to the premise. So the premise is strong, but the craft of it is so high that you're like, my mouth was agape the whole time, at the same time as, and the fact that the guy that they got who wasn't into it or didn't know, was so genuine and perfect.
Oh, just perfect. He was like such a nice guy, and just like
he was trying to like people please at the same time as stand up for himself and have conviction, and him working through all of that in encountering all these really amazing situations.
Yeah.
It was, I mean, I want to be more like him, for sure. I think
definitely
it works on so many levels.
It was like the most satisfying series, and I was looking at this on the IMDb, and the last episode was the highest rated of that series. And the interesting thing is, the last episode was just kind of like a behind the scenes episode, which is so good because it really kind of gives you insight into how the whole thing came together, and it was so satisfying just to see it happen.
Yeah, and as someone always looking at architecture, I was that last episode, they reveal the tricks about where they put cameras and how they hid microphones and like the spatial challenges of things was really fascinating to me too.
I think my idea of what a courtroom is supposed to look like is totally based on what I've seen in movies and TVs. Because when I've been to real courtrooms, they never look that cool. And I live in Marin County. It's just north of San Francisco, and the courthouses, the Marin Center and the Marin Civic Center were all designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. It was one of his last projects, and wow. To me, well, as an aside, I think Frank Lloyd Wright is kind of overrated, but that's my hot take.
Them's fighting words.
That's all right. I'm not an architect. But you go into the Marin Center, and it to me, I mean, I get it. He's making this architecture that kind of blends in with the land, and it looks real cool. But to me, that none of the stuff is really very functional there. It's just kind of weird. And the courthouses, I think the courtrooms are kind of a good example. They're really super cramped, and they're kind of nondescript. It's got that 60s. You know what it is it's not old enough to be cool old. It just looks like it's like, oh, dated. Like it needs to be freshened up somehow.
Yeah.
And I just lost my whole audience by just trashing on Frank Lloyd.
No, I mean, it's definitely one of his more like bold in a way that feels like decorative kind of buildings. You know, it's a later building of his.
Yeah, I guess they built the whole Marin Center after he died, so he never even got to see it completed.
Yeah, so I mean, I mean it's cool, but I can see your criticism of it, where the sort of functional part is sort of just functional, and the spectacular decorative part is just decorative. You know, like I think that does feel like kind of the case versus maybe say like the Guggenheim or something,
right,
which is also bold, but like the boldness and decoration sort of goes into the way that the museum works, kind of more wholly.
Right. So this is the classic form over function kind of thing, which I think in this case is probably happening. It really does look beautiful and interesting, but it's really it's hard to navigate inside of it. It's very confusing. And just the rooms are it's just weird. The courtrooms, even like the jury box. I had to sit in on a jury one time. I didn't get selected, but I kind of like not getting selected, but I was also kind of like, wait, why didn't you want me? What's wrong with me? But the jury boxes are so crammed in there, and I don't know how a jury could sit through like a whole day of sitting in there. So
Frank Lloyd Wright thought that big people, larger size people, tall people were a waste of space. Literally, because he was quite short. Yeah, he was very short.
And see, that's my problem. I'm 6'1".
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's your problem. That building was not meant for you. I mean, going into real deep, and feel free to cut this, but in that era, in the 50s and 60s, there was a book written called The Decorated Diagram, and basically the critique of architecture of that period was like the way I described the building is like there's the functional thing and the decorative things, and they're separate. They're not part of the same scheme. Like they're just like divorced from one another. And you can have functional things, but maybe the decoration, like the exuberant part, like helps it to be functional, or vice versa. So in that era, that was identified as a problem, and I think people were challenged to kind of get outside of that box a little bit.
Are there still architects doing radical work? I guess Frank Lloyd Wright would have been considered radical, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. I don't think there's anyone that is as prolific as Frank Lloyd Wright at the moment that would be, I think, categorized in that way. He did a lot of houses, and he did houses of varying price points. He did some that were not so expensive. He did ones that were meant to be like prefabricated and built everywhere. He did very rich ones for rich people. And then these more public buildings kind of were a little bit, and bigger buildings were a little more sparse. And I just don't see anyone occupying a similar space of being able to really explore architectural ideas by doing houses at such a grand scale that he was able to do them. I think it's maybe a different time. I think he built up such a persona that people wanted to commission him to design their houses just for prestige's sake. So yeah, he was in a very unique spot that way. I mean, yes, there are amazing architects that are really pushing the boundaries, but I don't think that they are. They haven't quite hit that sweet spot. Like maybe. Yeah.
Well, you have to be able to sell your stuff
yes.
too. I mean, so it's one thing to have radical designs, but in practicality, that's got to be difficult to get.
Yeah, and then then did you sell out at that point? Do you just kind of repeat
right.
yourself? You know, so like Frank Gehry, I would put him close. Like he's quite prolific. He's pretty well embraced by the schools. Think what he does is at least worth talking about and thinking about at the same time as he's a very public figure. He's a little older now. Like I think his heyday was a few years ago, not his heyday, but the height of his popularity was a few years ago, but I would put him in that space. Once you get on The Simpsons, I feel like that's pretty big.
You've made it. You've definitely made it. Where do you consider yourself in the spectrum of design? And what do you have your own style? Would you consider
that style? I would consider myself very aligned with postmodernism. And that goes with the idea that buildings tell stories and stuff. So I like designing in ways that people can come to it and then maybe think, well, that's a little unique. Why would that be that way? Or I recognize that, but that's a little bit different looking than I've seen it before. And kind of am getting into that. So YouTube has been my primary creative outlet for the last couple of years. I've done some pavilions and things like that recently, and some exhibitions and writing, but the design work hasn't been quite as prolific.
But as far as looking at designs, is what attracts you the most?
Oh, that's a good question. I have to think about that. That's like a.
It kind of depends on the context, I suppose.
It depends on the context. I tend to like when things are 90% serious and like 10% fun and unexpected.
Okay, that's a good balance.
Yeah, I think that to me is a really great ratio where there's like not that it's a wink, but that you can tell that they're not too earnest. I think that they're taking it seriously, but at the same time letting you know that there's room to have fun here. And I think that ratio for me is maybe it's a little off, but I'll have to fine tune the exact ratio. But I think any time that happens, I'm
you're
sold.
Seeing a bit of the personality of the architect show through. Yeah.
And allowing others to put their own personality, oh, that's weird. Why is that like that? Anybody coming upon it who hopefully can read that into it. So and feel the little playfulness of it for sure.
Are there any trends happening? Right, I would imagine sustainability.
Oh, for sure.
These eco issues have got to be top tier right now.
For sure. I think there's that, which is coupled with buildings that don't look too extravagant. So even if it is expensive, you kind of hide it a little bit. So that's a trend, I think. Things that don't look too bold, too flamboyant, because that was a strategy a few years ago, and then financial crisis hits and things like that, and people kind of sober up and they make their buildings a little more austere. So I think that that is a trend. I think, this might lose some audience, but the idea that the parts of the building look like separate parts versus cohering as a single whole is a bit of a trend. So you would recognize, I don't know, the columns, like look that they're separate from the rest of the building or something like that. So this kind of separation of the elements to be expressive of their own uniqueness versus it coming together as a whole is kind of a trend. And there's others like that that make their way into different places. So, what happens in the United States might not be exactly what's happening in Europe, but for the most part.
Does the United States have any sort of style of its own, definable architectural style?
That's a good question.
The McMansion.
Yes. I mean, yeah. I mean, there's certainly like
Doesn't
negative
that sort
ones.
of symbolize America right there? I mean,
that was what was so great about Frank Lloyd Wright, I think, was that he was trying to design a uniquely American kind of architecture. So like he was interested in, like, we have vast plains and open space that Europe could never dream of. So our buildings should be spread out and horizontal and express that. And so like what you see in like Marin or like the Guggenheim in New York is that he wasn't very good at designing buildings in cities, because like the Guggenheim kind of pulls, like a normal city building fills out the block. It presents a street edge, versus the Guggenheim, which pulls away from the street and things like that, because he was kind of caught in that mindset of like, got to spread it out and things like that. But other uniquely American things, I mean, certainly things that maybe look a little flimsier. I think
we're defined by our flimsiness.
Maybe. I think too, you could define it like in the negative. Like if you go to Switzerland, you will see steel buildings that have a very expressive grid. For instance, you'll see the grid in the building a lot, and maybe in the United States that's maybe less a thing. So you could define it negatively like that, or I'm trying to think of other uniquely American.
Are you familiar with the Eichler house?
Yeah,
Eichler houses.
Yes.
Okay, so we've got a number of those in my neighborhood, and now those have become like historical buildings, or I don't know what they call them, and they command a much higher price. But I've been to many of these Eichlers, and they're cold, and I don't think they were designed definitely not for energy efficiency. But again, this would have been back in the 50s probably when most of these. These are small, like 1,400 square foot houses.
Yeah, so I mean, he's kind of quintessential mid-century modern, and I think that the popularity of mid-century modernism, I think, kind of captured Eichler. And I think that's a really unique time where houses in the 50s and 60s, it was okay. I don't know, like there was that experimentation with it looking a little more modern, and that being okay, and that being a desirable thing. And I have lived in a very unique house that by most accounts people would think was cold. It had like white tile throughout. It was built in the 70s, so it wasn't exactly like mid-century modern, but it was very architecturally out there. And you would be surprised how it didn't take long for it to feel homey to me. Mm-hmm. So it has tall ceilings. And all of a sudden, a few months in, I felt oppressed by 8-foot high ceilings. Like the tall ceiling felt like home. Yeah. And so the idea of it feeling comfortable and homey, it feels like that's from me. Like that is what I think is homey is this, and that's just ingrained. But a lot of that is learned in a certain way, and a lot of it can change pretty fast. And I guess that's another message that I have for people to kind of think about architecture, that there is room for that, and not to change your mind or anything, and definitely different strokes for different folks, but it does happen. And even though I do have an appreciation for that stuff, just inherently, I think that other people can learn to appreciate it too, in a way that's not forced on you. It's just kind of like, oh, this does feel okay. This feels different, and I think it could be okay after a while.
Well, I think any older house is always going to be a much more interesting place to live. I mean, my house was built in 1956, and I mean, I'm sure at the time it was nothing special. They just
Right.
like, it's a little ranch house. But over the years, people have changed it and modified it. And in this whole neighborhood, all the houses are kind of like uniquely different. Even there's like 5 different design styles in this neighborhood, but they all look so totally different over the years. And you're right. You just kind of adapt with it, and all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah, this is pretty comfortable. It's a small space.
Yeah, I'm sure in the 50s your neighborhood looked awful. Like,
Oh yeah.
it would, all the houses would have looked alike. The trees wouldn't have been in yet. Like, it would have been a conformist dream.
Probably,
Post-war housing, but like,
Yeah.
over time,
it
people
just develops.
it develops, and people develop it to be what they want, and difference starts to come in. And that's that idea of character again, like
Yeah.
it grew a character over time. And that role of time for appreciating a place is really fascinating for sure.
When these places were built, every house got one tree in their front yard. And we have one of the few houses left that still has the original tree. This is
wow.
enormous coastal live oak tree in the front yard. And so it's just interesting to see, knowing the history. And again, I think this goes back to the story behind all of this. It makes for your living spaces to be much more interesting than just like the McMansions, which are just hideous places.
Yeah. And I think there are design things that you can think about in design at the outset that can more allow for that growth over time to have a positive effect than other decisions. And so that would be something that I'd always promote. I think that like you talk about a McMansion sort of suburb, there's things that choices in there that don't allow it to live over time and grow with the residents, and to have a say in it in the same way that like the neighborhood you are talking about has. So it's not just about like, well, everything needs time to grow. Yes, growth and time change it, but there are also things that can be planned at the outset that I think can allow for that process to be more positive than others.
Do you know what I've been getting obsessed with ever since the last time I talked to you is liminal spaces. I'm obsessed. I love them. I'm just like, I can't. I have a folder of photos on my phone of just all the liminal spaces I've taken. So I was at this. This was that conference I went to a couple weeks ago in Denver, and it's like, now see, this is an example of, okay, you go out to the Denver airport. You've probably been through Denver before. It's just in the middle of nowhere. The airport is like so separate from Colorado. It's just out in the prairie, practically Kansas. And so they had this conference at this big, massive resort. It's called the Gaylord. There's a number of these Gaylord hotels around the U.S., but it's this Gaylord resort thing. But it's like 15 minutes from the airport, but it's also like 15 minutes from anything else. And it's just like plopped down in the middle of nowhere. And everybody was there saying, wow, this is Colorado. I'm like, well, if you go like 100 miles west, you'll see the Colorado you're expecting with the mountains and all of this. But I don't know. It's just so strange that somebody would design this. And it's this kind of over the top building with very little restraint into it that has no character of its own. It's like they're trying to put it, you walk through this huge revolving door, and there's like this fake treasure chest with jewels coming out. And I mean, I love kitschy stuff, but this wasn't like trying to be kitschy or anything. It was just like, what's going on here?
That's great.
But this place was filled with weird liminal spaces that were just so bizarre, and you wonder. Oh, here, let me find a picture.
I'm fine. Yeah, I pulled it up. I'm seeing it.
Isn't that? It's a monstrosity.
It is. I mean,
so look at this picture here. Oh, see, now this is good. Now I've got YouTube. I can show pictures. So look at that.
Yeah.
It's like,
oh my
so
God.
this is an empty space with like two chairs, just
a couple
by
bushes.
themselves. Why would somebody sit? And somebody at some level of management said, you know what? let's put a couple of chairs right down there in that empty spot where nobody's going to sit because
And
it's
full
just a
lighting too.
pass-through.
It was like brightly lit, a spotlight right on it.
That's just horrible.
Yeah,
But
those kinds
I
of
don't know why. I'm just they give me a sense of uneasiness, and yet I'm really drawn to these spaces.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating thing, and I mean, yeah,
This is I got to show you this one.
Yeah.
This is not the hotel. This was at a waiting room at
oh my God, the way they line up with the stripes.
yeah, except the one chair is like slightly off. I just wanted to go over there and straighten it up, but
Yeah, that's great. Like, I think that the popularity of liminal spaces just shows like how ripe people are for like engaging their like how spaces make them feel and trying to understand that, like, and that is perfect, like those spaces are off-putting and like why, and trying to understand, I think, is really fascinating. Like, I'm looking at the photo of that place, and it does have elements of trying to look like a Swiss chalet or something,
but it's not in the mountains.
but it's not in the mountains.
It's in the prairie out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah. It shows the limits of like one person's vision, I think, like to be able to plan how much space makes sense for one architect to control and make. Like that scale just doesn't make sense for one person. Like, it needs the difference of different people managing and engaging it. That's just like the kind of blandness spread out over. I could imagine that a lot of people service a lot of people. Yeah,
but I don't know who would. They have the conference center, so that's got to be the only reason people do go there is for these conferences. Because why would you plan a vacation and then stay here where you can't go anywhere? You'd have to take an Uber to get to. Even if you wanted to go into Denver, it's probably a 30-40 minute drive, I suppose. It's like way out there.
Yeah, that's big business, man. Like, like there's a huge conference center here in Chicago, and like the leverage that, I don't know, there's just a really odd like network of those kinds of places that you're talking about in the world that like it's a unique ecosystem sort of these conferences they're nowhere and everywhere at the same time.
Yeah. It's just odd that they try to add some character to it by adding just odd things that don't fit with anything else around there. It's just a mishmash of, oh, here's a piece of artwork made out of scrap wood or something. It's like, okay, it's nice, but how does that fit in with the overall look of this place? I don't know. Yeah. I just thought it was an interesting, bizarre experience.
Yeah. I mean, it also, I think, showcases the challenge of different scales. So the fact that it's so huge, and the way they broke it down was to have as many pitched roofs as possible.
Right.
So it's like, so if it's too big, you need to like break down the scale. And I think like what you're talking about the interior is, it's like the way of thinking about the interiors wasn't the right scale either. It's like one room gets 2 chairs, and they're not the right size for the room. And like the room's too big for them. It's just like a whole breakdown of.
It's an architectural fail.
That's right. For sure.
How's YouTube going for you? Looks like you're doing really well, huh?
Oh, thanks. YouTube's good. Like, it's a bit of you're catching me at a little of an odd time with it. It's always good. I'm always trying new things, and I love creating as somebody in architecture and things, and the medium of video for me is just, I love exploring the creative parts of it. So there's certainly just the message of it, but then the creative part I think is great. I think one of the challenges for me, and maybe you probably experience this too, is there's like a gap between the way that the product, your creative act is received and consumed to its production. So I don't see people watching the videos. I don't know what that's like for people, and YouTube's process segments that off, and so all you get is this abstraction of that, the data. And I think that kind of connection with the audience is really important and a unique challenge. And I think, I don't know, it's just something I've noticed and trying to work through, maybe just personally, but is really unique to the medium. And I don't know, something that I'm wrestling with these days, like how to understand the connection with the audience when your direct feedback of the audience is so abstract and removed. For sure.
That's an interesting point. Yeah. Because I'm in my 15th year now of YouTube, and it seems like the audience is it's never that one audience so somebody joins your channel, so to speak, they start watching your videos and then eventually they go away, but other people come back. So everything you're doing now is always new to somebody. And so I always find that interesting that I can explore even older topics.
Right.
And people don't mind. There's not anybody who's like, hey, you did this once 12 years ago. Why are you
Isn't that weird?
Again? Yeah.
Yeah, as someone creative, that feels like a cop-out. But there's some videos that I watch, like, I don't know, the Ammo channel where they just washes cars. And he says the exact same things in every single video, and I love it. Like if he doesn't say like why he's using that particular soap, I'm like, I miss it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because people find you, and that's their first experience with you, and they don't want to feel left out. And
that's a really strange phenomena, like a disconnect between what resonates in the audience versus what it feels like when you're making it. Feels like a problem. It's an asset, actually, and it's a really unique thing for sure.
You have one of those channels that I like to cast, the Chromecast, to my TV.
Oh, really?
Because it's one of these that has such a polished look about it, and it's just fun for me it's a good sit back experience. It's not something I want to like casually watch on my phone while I'm eating lunch or something. Although I do that too, but these are the types of videos that I really like, the ones that I can just kind of have a more cinematic experience.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I too have channels that I kind of only watch on Chromecast. Yeah, I do divide that, like the Baumgartner restoration where he just cleans the paintings. Like that's a TV one. That's I like that on TV for whatever reason. But that's interesting that you said that about my channel. I have heard that that's becoming more popular on the platform. I hear that's a burgeoning thing, and I would hope that trend would continue. And I appreciate that you're saying that my channel is that way. And
well, and I think it's also because your videos are so well thought out and researched and presented. You're not like, hey guys, come along with me and we're going to check out some spooky buildings or something. Right. It's more scholarly and interesting than that.
Yeah, thanks. Well, yeah, I'll think about that. That's a good observation that I think will factor into the way that I think about them for sure.
So before we go, I have a suspicion that a lot of people walk around town daily without ever really looking at the architecture surrounding them. I mean, why should people care about architecture, and what can they do to really start to notice the differences in buildings?
Wow. Yeah, that's like my life's mission right there. So you're cutting right to the heart. Yeah, that's another, like, stepping back a minute, that's another thing that I find with YouTube so interesting. It's like things that I just inherently think is important isn't necessarily what other people think is important. So I just inherently think that that's important. Like, you should care about your environment.
Everybody should love architecture.
Yeah, and not everyone comes at it that way. And so you gotta know why. And I don't know if I do. Like, so every video for me is actually that process of like, why should someone care? Like, I come at this just assuming that people should, or that it's inherently interesting, but having to think about why. You know what? I'll have a couple little answers. Like the video that you talked about, the stuff you're not meant to notice in the base of skyscrapers. Like, for me, that's a way of and I kind of said it about the courtrooms too. It's like, there's stuff here that isn't that way because people really wanted it to be that way. And so maybe giving people a little bit of slack or appreciating why it's there for functional reasons, and maybe appreciating versions that are better than others and things like that could be a good thing. I guess other reasons why people should just care. I mean, I think the environment has such an impact on you without you knowing it, that to understand yourself, I feel like you need to understand your environment.
I think these are things we need to think about, because we can all live perfectly fine in a square box.
Yeah.
Really. But nobody really wants to live like that. We all inherently have this need for more art.
Yeah, and in the same way that everyone should travel to see how other people live, I think understanding what, even if it's not something you want to change, but understanding the layout of your living room and why it is the way it is great, because you can choose another way maybe, or not. You can just I like it this way and that's the way it is. But I think knowing why and how it got that way, I think is of value. And then your other question about how to maybe embark on that process of understanding. Well, first, watch my channel, but two, I mean, I think what I found also is really interesting is maybe asking people about buildings that they might have particular knowledge of. So if you get to someone's house, what do you like about this house? Or, even I was browsing Reddit yesterday, and there was a door of a movie theater that was floating on the second level, and it was inaccessible. It was why is there a stupid door? Who the hell would put a door up there? That makes no sense. And then a projectionist comes into the conversation and says, well, the reason that door is there because the equipment often can't go up the stairs that are provided for the projectionists. They need to be delivered in a way it's so big that it doesn't make sense to amend the interior to accommodate this once in a decade change. And so you just put a door. And a projectionist knew that. So someone in the movie theater would have known why that is. And so if you have a curiosity about why something is the way it is, maybe someone around, you could ask them and you would learn. And maybe there's a good reason, maybe there's not. But either way, I think it builds an appreciation for the world around you in a way that's productive.
Get out of your car too. Just go out downtown and walk around. Look up. Actually look at the buildings. Sometimes it's hard to see the individual trees for the forest, but if you're down amongst it, you can actually examine some of these buildings and appreciate what went into those.
Yeah, for sure.
Stewart, it was great talking to you again. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. It's been great.